The alarm clock screamed at 4:30 a.m., cutting through the darkness of Marcus Chen's cramped Queens apartment like a knife through silence. 23 years of the same routine had trained his body to wake moments before the jarring sound, but he never turned it off early. The noise was a reminder of his reality. Another day in the shadows of John F. Kennedy International Airport. Another 8 hours of invisible labor that kept America's busiest airport running. The digital display cast a sickly green glow across his face as he rolled out of bed, joints protesting with the familiar ache of middle age and decades of manual work. At 42, Marcus's body carried the weight of every heavy suitcase, every rushed shift, every double overtime when younger workers called in sick. His hands, scarred and calloused from handling millions of bags over the years, reached for the blue uniform hanging on the back of his bedroom door. The fabric was worn thin at the elbows and knees, faded from countless washes in the building's basement laundromat. Employee number 47,291. Baggage handler, level 2. $18.50 an hour. No benefits worth mentioning. No pension to speak of after the company had restructured its retirement program 3 years earlier. The bathroom mirror reflected a face that had aged beyond its years. Gray streaked through his black hair, and lines carved deep around his eyes told the story of 2 decades spent squinting under fluorescent lights in windowless facilities. His ex-wife used to joke that he looked like he was permanently tired, but that was before the divorce, before the lawyers, before she'd taken half of everything he'd never really owned anyway. Now he lived alone in this one-bedroom apartment that cost 60% of his monthly income, eating microwave dinners and watching Netflix on a television he'd bought at a pawn shop. The shower ran cold for the first 3 minutes, as it always did. The building's ancient plumbing system was just another reminder that Marcus lived in the forgotten corners of New York City, where infrastructure crumbled and landlords collected rent without making repairs. He shaved quickly with a disposable razor that had seen too many uses, then dressed in his uniform while coffee brewed in a machine that had stopped working properly months ago. The coffee was weak and bitter, but caffeine was caffeine, and Marcus needed every advantage he could get to make it through another day. The drive to JFK in his 15-year-old Honda Civic gave Marcus 30 minutes to steel himself for another day of being nobody. The car had 247,000 miles on it and made concerning noises when he turned left, but it started most mornings and got him to work, which was all he could afford to ask. Past the sleeping suburbs of Queens, past the billboards advertising luxury goods he'd never afford, past the early morning commuters heading to Manhattan jobs that paid more in a month than he made in 6. The airport's lights grew brighter as he approached, a sprawling complex that processed over 60 million passengers annually, generating billions in revenue for airlines, retailers, and everyone except the people who actually made it function. Marcus knew every street that led to the airport, every shortcut and traffic pattern that could save him 5 minutes on his commute. He'd driven this route so many times that he could do it with his eyes closed, navigating by muscle memory and the rhythm of traffic lights that never seemed to sync properly. The neighborhoods he passed through told the story of economic inequality that defined his world. Wealthy enclaves where airport executives lived in houses worth more than he'd earned in a lifetime, transitioning gradually to working-class areas where people like him struggled to make ends meet. The employee parking lot was a sea of aging vehicles owned by people who kept the airport running but remained invisible to the traveling public. Maintenance workers, baggage handlers, security guards, cleaning staff, thousands of people who arrived before dawn and left after dark, their names unknown to the passengers who depended on their labor. Marcus parked in section E7, the same spot he'd claimed for the past decade. The asphalt was cracked and potholed, never repaired because employee areas weren't priorities for the Port Authority's maintenance budget. The walk to the employee entrance took him past the main terminals, where even at this early hour, travelers moved with purpose toward destinations he'd never see. Business executives heading to meetings in cities Marcus had only heard about on the news. Families departing for vacations that cost more than his annual salary. Students returning to colleges that charged tuition fees equivalent to several years of his wages. Through the reinforced glass doors, past security checkpoints that scanned his badge and biometrics with technology that cost more than his car, down elevators that descended into the airport's hidden circulatory system, a maze of corridors, conveyor belts, and sorting facilities that existed entirely out of sight of the paying public. The transition from the public areas to the employee zones was jarring. Upstairs, everything was designed for comfort and efficiency: polished floors, modern lighting, climate control that maintained perfect temperatures year-round. Downstairs, in the world where Marcus spent his days, the aesthetic was purely functional. Concrete floors that echoed with every footstep, fluorescent lights that hummed and flickered, air circulation systems that moved stale air through spaces that rarely saw natural light. This was the industrial backbone that supported the glossy consumer experience above, and everyone who worked here understood their place in the hierarchy. The baggage sorting facility was a cathedral of efficiency, with ceilings that disappeared into darkness and the constant thunder of aircraft engines reverberating through steel and concrete. The space was enormous, larger than several football fields, filled with conveyor belts that snaked through the area like mechanical rivers. Thousands of bags moved through the system every hour, sorted by destination, carrier, and priority level, with precision that amazed even veteran workers. The noise was constant and overwhelming. The rumble of conveyor motors, the beeping of scanning equipment, the hydraulic hiss of sorting mechanisms, the distant roar of jets taking off and landing. Workers in blue uniforms moved between towering stacks of luggage, their movements choreographed by years of repetition. Each person had their assigned zone, their specific responsibilities, their quota of bags to process each shift. The work was physically demanding and mentally numbing. Lifting, scanning, loading, sorting, hour after hour, with brief breaks that never felt long enough. Injuries were common, repetitive stress disorders endemic, but workers rarely complained because jobs that paid $18 an hour with health insurance were hard to find. This was Marcus's world, a place where he was simultaneously essential and invisible, where his expertise kept the system running smoothly while his presence barely registered on anyone's consciousness. Passengers trusted that their luggage would arrive at their destinations, but they never thought about the people who made that possible. Airport executives knew the statistics: bags processed per hour, error rates, efficiency metrics, but the workers who generated those numbers were just entries in a database. Janet Morrison, the facility supervisor, handed him his assignment clipboard without looking up from her computer screen. At 55, Janet had managed cargo operations longer than most people had worked anywhere, and her efficiency was legendary. She'd started as a baggage handler herself, back when the job paid better and offered more opportunities for advancement. Now she oversaw 200 employees across 3 shifts, managing schedules and quotas with the precision of a military operation. She spoke in shorthand, expecting her workers to fill in the gaps with experience. Chen, special handling today. Diplomatic cargo from Miami arrived on Flight 447, Gate C7. Everything goes straight to federal inspection, no delays, no questions. Priority routing, chain of custody documentation required. Make sure you get signatures at every transfer point. Marcus nodded, taking the clipboard and scanning the manifest. Special handling assignments came up maybe once a week, usually involving government shipments or high-security cargo that required additional protocols. The paperwork was more complex, the security procedures more stringent, but the pay was the same. The work was easier in some ways: fewer bags, more careful handling, direct routes to secure areas. He'd done hundreds of these assignments over the years without incident, moving everything from classified documents to diplomatic pouches to sensitive electronics that couldn't risk damage during transport. The special handling area was separated from the main facility by reinforced glass walls and additional security checkpoints. Access required special clearance that Marcus had earned through years of reliable service and background checks that delved deep into his personal history. The government wanted workers who were stable, predictable, and financially secure enough to resist temptation. Marcus had passed every screening, his modest lifestyle and consistent employment record marking him as exactly the kind of invisible, trustworthy employee the system depended on. Marcus badged through 3 separate doors before reaching the climate-controlled space where premium and sensitive cargo waited for processing. The lighting was brighter here, the floors cleaner, everything designed to handle materials that couldn't risk damage or contamination. Temperature and humidity were carefully controlled to protect sensitive electronics and documents. Security cameras monitored every angle, recording activities that would be reviewed by federal agents if anything went wrong. 6 pieces of luggage sat on the steel sorting table, expensive designer brands that Marcus recognized from advertisements, but had never touched outside of work. Hermes, Louis Vuitton, Bottega Veneta. Each bag was pristine, the kind of luggage that cost more than Marcus earned in several months. The craftsmanship was obvious even to his untrained eye. Hand-stitched leather, polished hardware, construction that was meant to last decades rather than years. Each bag bore a red diplomatic tag marked Federal Courier, Inspection Exempt, and routing labels that would send them directly to a secured area without passing through normal security screening. Marcus began his routine, scanning each bag's identification code with his handheld device. The system was sophisticated, tracking every movement and interaction with precision that left no room for error. Each scan updated the cargo tracking database and generated routing instructions that appeared on his device's screen. But as he lifted the first suitcase to place it on his transport cart, something made him pause. The bag was much heavier than it should have been. 23 years of handling luggage had given Marcus an almost supernatural ability to estimate weight and contents. His hands could distinguish between a bag packed with clothes and one filled with books. He could tell if electronics were packed properly or if fragile items needed special handling. A medium-sized suitcase packed with clothes, electronics, and personal items typically weighed 30 to 40 pounds. This bag felt closer to 65 pounds, with a density that suggested something far more compact than typical travel items. The weight distribution was wrong too. Instead of the uneven balance of personal belongings, this bag felt uniformly dense, as if packed with materials of consistent weight and size. Marcus lifted it again, confirming his initial assessment. His experience handling diplomatic cargo had taught him that government materials were often heavier than expected. Classified documents were printed on special paper, electronic equipment was ruggedized for security, but this felt different. As Marcus positioned the second bag on his cart, the zipper gap shifted slightly, revealing a glimpse of the contents inside. For just a moment, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat, the unmistakable green of U.S. currency. Not a few bills tucked into a travel wallet, but stacks of cash packed so tightly the bag could barely contain them. The bills appeared to be hundreds, bundled with rubber bands and arranged in neat rows that maximized the use of available space. Marcus looked around quickly. The special handling area was empty except for him. The security cameras focused on entry points rather than the sorting tables. His heart rate increased as he processed what he'd seen, but his hands remained steady. Years of routine had trained him to maintain composure regardless of circumstances, and that training served him now. He adjusted the bag carefully, widening the gap just enough to confirm what he'd seen. Vacuum-sealed bundles of $100 bills, layer upon layer, filling every available space in the luggage. The bills were crisp and new, suggesting they'd been recently printed or carefully stored. Each bundle contained what appeared to be several $1,000s, and the bag held dozens of bundles. His mind began calculating. If each bag contained similar amounts, he was looking at millions of dollars in cash. The math was staggering, beyond anything he'd imagined possible. The implications hit him like a physical blow. These weren't diplomatic materials in any legitimate sense. This was money laundering on an industrial scale, using fake diplomatic credentials to move drug cash through legitimate airline channels. The inspection-exempt tags that he'd processed dozens of times weren't protecting classified documents. They were shielding criminal proceeds from the very security systems designed to detect them. And Marcus had been handling similar shipments for months, maybe years, without realizing what he was carrying. The revelation transformed his understanding of everything he'd observed over the past year. The regular Tuesday and Friday schedule that never varied. The unusual weight he dismissed as electronics or books. The fake federal agents who processed these shipments without ever opening them. The entire operation was hidden in plain sight, protected by diplomatic immunity and the assumption that government cargo was beyond question. Marcus continued loading the bags, but his movements were different now. More careful, more observant. Each piece of luggage felt like it contained a fortune, and probably did. As he wheeled the cart toward the federal inspection area, His mind raced through memories of similar assignments. How many times had he handled millions of dollars without knowing it? How much money had passed through his hands over the months, carried by a man who struggled to pay his rent and lived on microwave dinners? The federal inspection area was a sterile white room with metal tables and scanning equipment that was never used. The space was designed to look official, complete with government seals and security cameras that recorded every interaction. Two men in dark suits waited for Marcus's delivery, just as they always did. They looked the part of federal agents. Conservative clothing, serious expressions, official identification badges that hung from lanyards around their necks. But Marcus had seen these same agents dozens of times over the past year, and he'd never thought to question their presence. The men didn't acknowledge him beyond a brief nod, treating him like a piece of equipment rather than a person. This was consistent with how most authority figures interacted with airport workers. Polite but distant, maintaining professional boundaries that reinforced the social hierarchy. Marcus had grown accustomed to being invisible, to having people look through him rather than at him. It was part of the job, part of being a service worker in a world where social class determined how people treated each other. But now Marcus realized these weren't federal agents at all. They were part of the operation, there to ensure the money continued its journey without interference. Their official appearance was just another layer of the deception, designed to maintain credibility with airport security and any workers who might notice the regular pattern of deliveries. As Marcus unloaded the bags and prepared to leave, he watched the fake agents process his delivery with new understanding. They didn't open the luggage or run it through any scanning equipment. Instead, they simply transferred it to another cart that would take it to a service exit where unmarked vans waited. The entire federal inspection was theater, designed to maintain the illusion of legitimate oversight while ensuring the money moved through the system untouched. The agents signed Marcus's paperwork with practiced efficiency, their signatures authorizing the next phase of a criminal operation that generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Walking back to his regular duties, Marcus felt like he was seeing the airport with new eyes. The familiar corridors seemed different now, charged with possibilities and dangers he'd never imagined. How many other operations were hiding in plain sight? How much money moved through these corridors every day, handled by workers who never realized they were part of the largest money laundering network in the country? And how had he become so invisible that criminals felt comfortable conducting business right in front of him? The rest of his shift passed in a haze of ordinary tasks: loading domestic baggage, sorting international arrivals, maintaining the careful choreography that kept flights on schedule. But Marcus's mind was elsewhere, processing what he'd discovered and what it meant for his future. He'd stumbled onto information that was worth millions to the right people and could get him killed by the wrong ones. The knowledge sat in his stomach like a stone, heavy with implications that extended far beyond his individual circumstances. Every bag he lifted now carried the possibility of containing hidden wealth. Every routine task felt different when viewed through the lens of his discovery. The airport that had been his workplace for over 2 decades had revealed itself as something else entirely. A financial highway where criminal proceeds moved freely under the protection of fake government credentials and corrupted security protocols. Marcus realized he was just one small part of a vast machine that laundered drug money with the efficiency and scale of a legitimate business operation. That evening, Marcus sat in his worn recliner with a beer and his laptop, researching everything he could find about airport money laundering. The internet revealed a world of criminal sophistication that boggled his mind. Networks that moved billions of dollars annually through seemingly legitimate channels, corrupting everyone from baggage handlers to federal agents to airline executives. The operation he discovered was just one small part of a global system that made traditional organized crime look like children playing with toy guns. The more he read, the more he understood the scope of what he'd uncovered. International drug trafficking organizations had evolved beyond simple smuggling operations into sophisticated financial networks that rivaled multinational corporations. They employed accountants, lawyers, and logistics specialists who understood global finance better than most legitimate business executives. They corrupted officials at every level of government and industry, creating protected channels for moving money that were nearly impossible to detect or disrupt. Marcus learned about trade-based money laundering, where criminal proceeds were disguised as legitimate commercial transactions. He read about bulk cash smuggling operations that moved millions of dollars across borders in everything from shipping containers to diplomatic pouches. He discovered that airports were particularly vulnerable to these schemes because of their complex regulatory environment and the volume of cargo that moved through them daily. The research painted a picture of an underground economy that dwarfed most legitimate industries. Conservative estimates suggested that international money laundering networks processed over $2 trillion annually, with a significant percentage flowing through American airports and financial institutions. The profits were so enormous that criminal organizations could afford to lose occasional shipments to law enforcement while still generating returns that made traditional investments look insignificant. But the research also revealed the violent reality behind these financial operations. The organizations that ran these networks didn't hesitate to eliminate threats to their business. Informants, competitors, and anyone who interfered with their operations faced consequences that were swift and brutal. Marcus read accounts of airport workers who'd been murdered for stealing cash from drug shipments, their bodies found in remote locations as warnings to others who might be tempted to take what didn't belong to them. Over the following weeks, Marcus began volunteering for additional special handling assignments, using his access to map the full scope of the operation. He documented flight numbers, timing patterns, and personnel rotations with the methodical precision of someone who understood that details could mean the difference between success and death. He estimated shipment values based on weight and density, calculating the network's volume with spreadsheets that he encrypted and hid on his laptop. The fake diplomatic cargo arrived like clockwork every Tuesday and Friday, usually on flights from Miami, Los Angeles, and Phoenix, cities that served as distribution hubs for South American drug cartels. Each shipment contained between 8 and 15 pieces of designer luggage, with total values ranging from $3 to $7 million based on Marcus's weight estimates. The consistency suggested an operation that had been running for years, moving money with the reliability of a legitimate shipping company. Marcus followed delivery vans from the airport to warehouses in Queens and Brooklyn, building a complete picture of how drug money entered the country as diplomatic cargo and emerged as legitimate business investments. The warehouses operated as distribution centers where cash was sorted, counted, and prepared for injection into the legal financial system through a network of shell companies and corrupt businesses. The operation's sophistication was breathtaking. Criminal organizations had created parallel financial institutions that could move money more efficiently than traditional banks. They employed teams of specialists who understood international finance, currency exchange, and regulatory compliance better than most legitimate financial professionals. They had corrupted officials at every level of the system, from airport workers to federal agents to bank executives, creating protected channels that operated with near impunity. The numbers were staggering when Marcus completed his analysis. Based on his observations, the network moved between $3 and $5 million twice a week through JFK alone, generating over $400 million annually just through his facility. Similar operations probably existed at airports across the country, creating a shadow financial system that processed more cash than many national economies. The scale was so enormous that traditional law enforcement approaches were inadequate to address the problem. But with knowledge came temptation, and Marcus's financial situation grew more desperate each month. His ex-wife's lawyer had garnished additional wages for back alimony, leaving him with barely enough money for rent and basic expenses. His daughter called from college, needing money for textbooks and living expenses that he couldn't afford to provide. His credit cards were maxed out, and his landlord had started making threatening phone calls about late rent that could result in eviction. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. He handled millions of dollars in drug money twice a week, wealth that could solve every financial problem he'd ever faced, while living paycheck to paycheck in a one-bedroom apartment that barely qualified as housing. The criminals who employed him treated him like furniture, invisible and disposable, while generating profits that exceeded the gross domestic product of small countries. The temptation grew stronger each time he handled a shipment. $7 million in cash could buy him a new life, pay off his debts, provide for his daughter's education, allow him to retire with dignity instead of working until he died in the basement of an airport. The money was already stolen, proceeds from criminal enterprises that destroyed communities and killed thousands of people annually. Taking it wouldn't create additional victims. It would simply redirect the flow of dirty money from one criminal organization to another. Marcus began researching the psychology of white-collar crime, trying to understand how ordinary people rationalize theft from their employers. He read about embezzlement cases where respected employees had stolen millions over decades, justifying their actions with elaborate mental frameworks that transformed theft into justice. He studied the techniques used by successful criminals to avoid detection and capture, learning about money laundering methods that could hide stolen cash from both law enforcement and criminal organizations. The plan formed gradually over sleepless nights and solitary research sessions. Marcus identified the vulnerabilities in the network's security protocols, weaknesses that existed because the criminals had become comfortable with their operations. They relied on diplomatic immunity to bypass airport security, but that same protection would make it difficult for them to report thefts to legitimate law enforcement. They depended on the invisibility of airport workers, but that same invisibility would make it hard to identify the source of any problems. The fake diplomatic credentials that bypassed airport screening could be turned against the operation. Service tunnels that connected the special handling area to employee parking provided routes that avoided main surveillance systems. Shift schedules that left certain areas unmonitored created brief windows of opportunity for someone who understood the timing. Most importantly, the arrogance of criminals who believed their operation was invisible to the very people who made it possible had created blind spots that could be exploited. Marcus spent weeks mapping the airport's security camera network, identifying dead zones where activities wouldn't be recorded. He studied the shift patterns of security guards and maintenance workers, learning when specific areas would be empty. He researched the specifications of luggage scanning equipment, understanding what materials would trigger alerts and what would pass unnoticed. Every detail mattered when the margin for error was measured in minutes and the consequences of failure were measured in lives. The psychological pressure of planning the theft while continuing to handle drug money twice a week was enormous. Marcus found himself studying the fake federal agents with new intensity, memorizing their faces and mannerisms, while maintaining the same invisible efficiency that had protected him for decades. He volunteered for overtime shifts that allowed him to observe security protocols during different time periods, building a comprehensive understanding of the airport's operational rhythms. Marcus also researched techniques for avoiding detection after the theft. He studied cases where criminals had successfully disappeared with large amounts of cash, learning about identity theft methods and document forgery techniques that could create new lives for people who needed to vanish completely. He researched countries with limited extradition treaties and banking systems that protected customer privacy. He learned about cryptocurrency exchanges that could convert cash into digital assets that were nearly impossible to trace. The preparation took on the character of a second job, requiring research and planning that consumed every spare moment. Marcus created encrypted files detailing security protocols, escape routes, and contingency plans for various scenarios. He opened safety deposit boxes under false names, created dead drops for emergency supplies, and established communication methods that couldn't be traced back to his identity. The level of preparation required was exhausting, but Marcus understood that success would depend on anticipating problems that hadn't yet occurred. 2 months after discovering the money laundering operation, Marcus identified the perfect opportunity. Intelligence gathered through weeks of surveillance indicated that a Friday afternoon transfer would contain between $8 and $10 million in cash, the largest regular shipment in the network's schedule. The timing coincided with a shift change that would reduce security presence in critical areas. Weather forecasts predicted overcast conditions that would limit visibility for external surveillance. Most importantly, the fake federal agents who processed these shipments had developed patterns of behavior that created predictable vulnerabilities. Marcus spent the week before the planned theft making final preparations. He used his security access to position equipment in strategic locations throughout the facility, disguising preparation activities as routine maintenance tasks. A cargo cart loaded with cleaning supplies and positioned near the service elevator. A maintenance dolly hidden in a storage room adjacent to the special handling area. Emergency lighting disabled in a section of corridor that led to the employee parking garage. Each piece of equipment was positioned to support the theft while maintaining plausible explanations for their presence. The psychological toll of the final preparations was severe. Marcus found himself unable to sleep, lying awake at night reviewing every aspect of the plan and imagining ways it could fail. The stress manifested in physical symptoms: headaches, nausea, trembling hands that he struggled to control during work hours. He forced himself to maintain normal routines, showing up for work on time and performing his duties with the same invisible efficiency that had characterized his career. The Friday chosen for his operation arrived with typical March weather, overcast skies and intermittent rain that would provide additional cover for his activities. Marcus arrived for his shift 30 minutes early, using his security access to confirm that equipment was positioned correctly and systems were functioning as expected. The airport felt different that morning, charged with possibilities that had been building for months. Every routine task carried additional weight. Every interaction with coworkers felt like it might be the last. Marcus reviewed his mental checklist one final time while preparing for the shift. The target shipment was scheduled to arrive on Flight 772 from Miami at 11:47 a.m., containing an estimated $9.2 million based on intelligence gathered over previous weeks. The bags would be processed through special handling and transferred to federal inspection by 12:30 p.m. The shift change that would create his opportunity window was scheduled for 12:45 p.m., providing exactly 15 minutes to execute the theft and escape before the next security rotation began. The morning passed with agonizing slowness as Marcus handled routine assignments while monitoring communications for updates about the target shipment. Flight 772 arrived on schedule, and Marcus watched the special cargo being unloaded through a window that overlooked the tarmac. 10 pieces of designer luggage, each containing a fortune that could transform his life or get him killed. The bags were transported to the special handling area where they would wait for his processing. Millions of dollars in drug money sitting unguarded in a secure facility that he had access to. At 11:55 a.m., Marcus received the assignment from Janet Morrison, who handed him the clipboard with the same routine efficiency she'd shown thousands of times before. The paperwork looked identical to previous diplomatic cargo assignments: routing instructions, chain of custody forms, security protocols that authorized him to transport the bags without additional oversight. But Marcus knew the contents represented more money than he'd earned in several lifetimes, wealth that could solve every problem he'd ever faced or create new problems that were infinitely worse. The walk to the special handling area felt longer than usual, each step carrying him closer to a decision that would irrevocably change his life. Marcus badged through the security checkpoints with hands that remained steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Years of routine had trained his body to function normally regardless of stress, and that training was serving him now. To outside observers, he looked like the same invisible airport worker he'd always been, processing another routine assignment with mechanical efficiency. The target shipment sat on the steel sorting table exactly as expected. 10 pieces of Hermes and Louis Vuitton luggage, pristine and expensive, each bearing diplomatic tags that would grant them safe passage through the airport's security systems. Marcus began his routine scanning process, but his movements were different now, more deliberate, more conscious of the weight and density that confirmed these bags contained the wealth he'd been planning to steal. The first bag felt exactly as heavy as his estimates had predicted, dense with bundled cash that had been vacuum sealed and arranged to maximize storage efficiency. Marcus lifted it with the same care he'd shown thousands of previous bags, but now the weight represented possibility rather than routine cargo. Each bag contained enough money to pay off his debts, support his daughter through college, and provide the financial security he'd never achieved through legitimate work. As Marcus loaded the bags onto his transport cart, he performed one final mental review of the theft plan. The route to the federal inspection area would take him past the service corridor where his hidden equipment waited. The fake agents who processed diplomatic cargo would be expecting his delivery at 12:30 p.m., providing a narrow window for executing the switch. The shift change that would create his escape opportunity was still 50 minutes away, requiring him to maintain normal behavior while carrying stolen drug money through airport security systems. The cart was heavier than usual as Marcus began the journey toward federal inspection, but the difference was slight enough to avoid notice from casual observers. The corridors of the special handling facility were empty, except for routine maintenance workers who paid no attention to another baggage handler performing standard duties. Marcus moved with the same measured pace he'd maintained for decades, invisible and unremarkable, while internally calculating the precise timing required for success. The switch took exactly 87 seconds, timed with precision that reflected months of planning and preparation. Marcus transferred the money-filled luggage from his official cart to the hidden cargo dolly, moving with efficiency born from decades of handling baggage under time pressure. Each bag was replaced with an identical designer piece filled with bundled newspapers and weighted with lead plates to match the original mass. The substitutes had been prepared over weeks of careful work, aged to look authentic and equipped with genuine-looking diplomatic tags that would pass casual inspection. The fake bags bore identification codes that Marcus had copied from previous shipments, creating documentation that would satisfy the superficial review process used by the corrupt federal agents. The lead weights were distributed to match the density patterns of bundled cash, ensuring that any handling would feel normal to people accustomed to processing these shipments. By the time anyone discovered the substitution, Marcus would be long gone, with enough money to disappear forever. Moving the stolen money from the service corridor to his vehicle required 3 carefully timed trips through infrastructure that he'd studied for months. Marcus used his decades of experience navigating the airport's hidden network, avoiding areas with heavy camera coverage, and timing his movements to coincide with shift changes that temporarily reduced security presence. The money went into his Honda Civic's trunk and back seat, hidden under tarps and maintenance equipment that made it look like routine supplies. Each trip felt like the longest walk of his life, but Marcus forced himself to maintain the same measured pace he'd used for decades. The stolen bags were heavier than any luggage he'd ever handled, dense with bundled cash that represented more wealth than he'd imagined possible. But his hands remained steady, his movements efficient, his expression showing the same disinterested professionalism that had made him invisible for 23 years. The most dangerous moment came when Marcus delivered the fake bags to the federal inspection area. The corrupt agents processed his delivery exactly as they always did, scanning documentation and transferring the luggage to their cart without examination. Marcus maintained his usual demeanor, invisible, efficient, unmemorable, while internally calculating how long he had before the deception was discovered. The agents signed his paperwork with practiced efficiency, their signatures authorizing the next phase of what they believed was a routine money laundering operation. Marcus completed the rest of his shift handling routine baggage assignments, maintaining his standard productivity metrics while internally processing what he'd accomplished. The theft had been executed flawlessly, but the real challenge was just beginning. Within hours, the cartel would realize their money was missing. Within days, they'd identify him as the only person with access and opportunity. Within weeks, both criminal organizations and law enforcement would be hunting him with resources that made escape seem impossible. The walk to his car at the end of his shift felt surreal. Marcus clocked out at exactly 1 p.m., the same time he'd been leaving work for years. Co-workers nodded with the same casual indifference they'd always shown, unaware that the invisible man walking past them had just committed the largest theft in airport history. The Honda Civic sat in its usual parking space, looking like the same aging vehicle he'd driven for years, but now containing enough drug money to buy a small country. The engine started on the third try, as it always did, and Marcus drove out of the employee parking lot with $9.2 million in stolen cash filling his back seat. He'd committed a crime that would generate international headlines and trigger one of the largest investigations in federal law enforcement history. But to anyone watching, he looked like the same tired middle-aged man who'd been finishing routine shifts at JFK for over 2 decades. The drive through Queens toward his apartment took him past neighborhoods that looked different now. The struggling working-class areas that had defined his world seemed smaller, less significant when viewed from the perspective of someone carrying generational wealth. But Marcus knew his transformation was temporary. He had perhaps hours before his theft was discovered, and his old life became impossible to maintain. The cartel discovered the theft exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes after Marcus completed his switch, faster than even his worst-case scenarios had predicted. The money laundering network included multiple verification points designed to catch exactly this kind of internal betrayal, systems that had been developed over years of operating sophisticated criminal enterprises. When the corrupt agents delivered the doctored bags to their warehouse facility, routine weight checks immediately revealed the discrepancy. The criminal organization's response to the discovery was swift and professional, reflecting the business-like efficiency that characterized modern drug trafficking operations. X-ray examination confirmed newspaper instead of currency, while chemical analysis of the lead weights used to match original mass provided forensic evidence of sophisticated planning. The substitution had been executed with precision that suggested extensive knowledge of their operations, limiting the pool of potential suspects to people with regular access to diplomatic cargo. Within 6 hours, cartel security specialists had identified Marcus as the only airport employee with both access to the shipment and sufficient knowledge of their operations to execute such a precise theft. His employment records, financial situation, and personal background made him the obvious suspect. More damning, security camera footage showed subtle changes in his behavior during the weeks leading up to the theft, patterns that suggested surveillance and planning that only became obvious in retrospect. The cartel's manhunt began immediately, with teams of investigators descended on JFK Airport to conduct discreet inquiries among employees who worked special handling assignments. They offered substantial rewards for information about Marcus's activities and associations, presenting themselves as federal agents investigating security breaches. They placed surveillance on his apartment building, his ex-wife's residence, and his daughter's college dormitory, creating a network of observation that could detect any attempt at contact or escape. Most ominously, the criminal organization activated networks throughout the northeastern United States to monitor transportation hubs, financial institutions, and any location where someone might attempt to flee with a large amount of cash. The resources deployed were extensive: hundreds of paid informants, corrupted officials in dozens of agencies, surveillance equipment that rivaled government capabilities. Marcus had stolen from people who operated with the efficiency of multinational corporations and the ruthlessness of military organizations. Marcus had anticipated this response, but the speed and thoroughness of the cartel's manhunt exceeded even his worst-case scenarios. He'd planned for a 24-hour head start before the theft was discovered, based on intelligence suggesting that verification procedures took place during regular business hours. Instead, he had less than 5 hours before every criminal organization on the East Coast received his photograph and a detailed description of his vehicle, along with instructions that capture was preferred but not required. The FBI became involved when 3 JFK Airport employees reported receiving death threats from unidentified callers, demanding information about Marcus Chen's whereabouts. Federal agents recognized the signature tactics of international drug trafficking organizations and immediately classified the case as a potential kidnapping and murder investigation. The threats were specific and credible, suggesting that criminal organizations were actively hunting someone connected to airport operations. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez of the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force took lead on the investigation, bringing 15 years of experience tracking international criminal networks to bear on what initially appeared to be a simple employee theft case. Martinez had worked cases involving airport security breaches before, but the scope and sophistication of the threats suggested something far more significant than routine embezzlement. As Martinez's team analyzed the evidence, they realized they'd uncovered something that threatened national security infrastructure. The diplomatic cargo credentials that had been compromised weren't simply fake documents. They represented a systematic breach of airport security systems that had been operating for years. The money laundering operations suggested corruption that extended throughout the aviation industry, law enforcement agencies, and federal inspection processes. As weeks turned into months, Marcus Chen became more myth than man, a ghost story whispered among airport workers and criminal organizations alike. Some investigators theorized that he'd been killed by associates who'd helped plan the theft. Others believed he'd fled to a country without extradition treaties, living quietly on money that would last several lifetimes. A few suggested he was still in the United States, hiding in plain sight using identity theft techniques that made detection impossible.